If you've ever read any books on evolution before, I'm sure you've come across probably the most famous book since Darwin's very own On the Origin of Species, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. This book is a controversial one, but also a truthful one. And to anybody interested in evolution, I highly recommend you take the time to read it. You won't be disappointed. So why do I say everybody is inherently selfish? To make the argument, let's first get an understanding of what a gene is. Organisms are built and maintained through a complex molecule called DNA. DNA is host to many different chemical interactions, bonds, and enzymes. But the process most important to life is DNA replication. This is something that occurs in all organisms, but in varying ways. When creatures reproduce sexually, the offspring get 50% of DNA from each parent, doing so through a process known as meiosis. So offspring are not 100% copies of each parent. Instead, they are a mix of both, sharing what we call a coefficient of relatedness that equals 50%. So that's what DNA is, the building block of life. But what is a gene? A gene is a section of DNA inside an organism that determines a trait. And of course, all organisms have many genes, all of which, when taken together, make up the traits of an organism. These traits are everything expressed and can range from things like height, eye shape, or hair color to the behavioral tendencies, personality, or risk for diseases. Gene expression and DNA is significantly more complicated than what I laid out. But this entry is enough for us to explore why everybody is inherently selfish. Most organisms have two versions of each gene, with each version being called an allele. Of course, what makes things complex is that one gene can affect multiple traits, and different traits can be expressed depending on whether alleles are dominant or recessive or a mix of both. And most traits are affected by several genes, or how they're expressed. So again, it's much more complicated than this, but a simple definition will make explaining the selfish gene easier. Richard Dawkins likens organisms to vehicles. They are just a transport system to get the gene from one generation to the next. So a gene, therefore, is not a chunk of DNA, it is a pattern, or more specifically, a sequence in a segment of DNA. A sequence that can exist in many physical copies across many different cells in many different vehicles across many different generations. So while an organism lives only once, a gene can be immortal if it is continually passed on from one generation to the next through all of time. Meaning long-term competition, so things like natural or sexual selection or an organism's ability to survive, is a competition that is only occurring between different genes. We as organisms are just the vehicle for these genes, kind of like how software is the end product of code. And code dictates exactly what the software does. Because of this, genes are considered the fundamental unit of selection, whether because of natural selection, sexual selection, niche construction, or anything else. This is the key idea of the selfish gene. Genes are the unit of selection. So if we then take a step back and envision ourselves in the place of a gene, one who can strategize and plan and predict, what would you do to make sure you are successful in replicating yourself into the next generation, in this life or death scenario against other genes? One way is to make your vehicle, which is the organism, really good at competing, making your vehicle more self-interested or better at mating, so you can then pass on your genes to the next vehicle, which would be the offspring. And if this comes at the expense of others, it doesn't really concern you. This could be employed by creatures that are actively selfish, like those who steal from others or only look out for their own best interests. But just because the gene is selfish doesn't mean the vehicle has to be selfish. It doesn't mean the organism has to be selfish as well. The gene can also encode for win-win situations, if this results in the end goal of the gene being propagated across time. This can and does include behavioral strategies, like agreeable personality traits, or traits that are good for the carrier of the gene and for carriers of other genes, and is why reciprocal altruism, so helping others and getting help in return, is also a relevant strategy for the inherent selfishness of all genes. So far, these gene strategies have been quite easy to understand, but the last strategy is not: self-handicapping. Why would one gene or one organism sacrifice itself for another, effectively giving up its ability to pass on its genes to the next generation, essentially doing the opposite of being selfish and acting against their own best self-interest? The answer lies in the principle of the relatedness coefficient. Without getting too technical, genes can exist across many different organisms at different times and in different amounts. So sacrificing one copy of a gene for 3 others is a worthy trade-off if you're a selfish gene. It doesn't really matter which genes survive because they are all the same. What matters is how many of the genes survive and get passed on. So from the perspective of a gene, sacrificing one copy to save even just 2 others is a worthy trade-off. This is called inclusive fitness, where a gene engages in this self-sacrificing behavior for its own copies rather than competing genes, which is one example of why we are so much more likely to be sacrificial for family members rather than friends or acquaintances. Even though a gene's effect can be good for individual carriers or for others, none are necessarily needed for a gene to be successful in passing itself on to the next generation. This is because genes are the unit of natural selection. So a gene's selfish strategy solely encompasses getting into the next generation. It doesn't matter how it does this. And this is why Richard Dawkins theorized we are all inherently selfish.